And it's good to see everybody virtually tonight. Hopefully, I'll give you some information that'll be useful for you as you prepare for the competitions. If any of you have gone through the learning objectives on the State Envirothon website, you'll see that they're very long. I won't be able to cover everything in this presentation, but I hope that this will be used as another tool in addition to those learning objectives and all the resources that are linked to those learning objectives. This will just be another tool that is useful for you as you sort of lay the groundwork for the soils knowledge you might need to know as you get ready for the competitions. So let's get started. I like to start with a concept. What is the concept of soil? We think we have a pretty good idea of what soil is, and some of you may have quite a good idea of what soil is, but conceptually, I think of the soil as being like the skin of the earth. And if we think of the earth as existing in these three spheres, soil is a little bit of a mix of all three. So what are those three spheres? We have the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere. The hydrosphere is all of our water, from our oceans down to our rivers, down to the little tributaries that flow into the rivers, down into even smaller bodies of water, like little pockets of groundwater in the soil, or little droplets of water vapor up in the air that make our clouds. All of that combined together is the hydrosphere. The lithosphere is the solid rock and the particles that weather off of that rock. So no matter where you are in the world, if you dig down deep enough, you will eventually hit bedrock. If you live in eastern Loudoun County or western Fairfax, you only have to dig down about 2 or 3 feet before you hit bedrock. If you live in eastern Fairfax, close to the Potomac River, you might have to go down 200 to 300 feet before you hit bedrock. So there's a big change, big difference in the depth of bedrock from spot to spot, even over small distances. But you will eventually hit bedrock, no matter where you are. As that bedrock weathers, it forms things like sands and boulders and gravels. All of that is part of the lithosphere. So that solid rock and the stuff that weathers from it. And then lastly, there's the atmosphere, which of course is the air above us, where that all three of those combine. That is really where we get soil. And that's an important concept to keep in mind, because when you look at what healthy soil consists of, the consistency might surprise you a little bit. We think of soil as a solid, and certainly there are a lot of solids in soil, but soil is only actually about 50% solid material. So about half of it is taken up by solids. This is by volume. The rest of the volume is a mix of air and water. So this is why that, the concept on the previous slide kind of comes into play. So soil is not just the remnants of weathered rock. It's also, very importantly, a good bit of air and a good bit of water all mixed together as well, too. When we look more at the solids, they're minerals, but there's also a small percentage that are organic. About 5% of the volume of soil is organic material. The other is mineral material, sand, silt, and clay, basically. And then again, 25% is air and 25% is water. Now, these proportions will change. That mineral and organic solid proportion usually stays pretty consistent at about 50%. If we have a really heavy rain, you're going to be looking at a soil that's about 50% minerals and 50% water. When the water drains out, the air takes its place. If we are in July in a really hot week and it hasn't rained for a good couple of weeks, there's going to be a lot more air in the soil than water. But on an annual basis, this is about what you would expect to find: 25% air, 25% water, 50% solids. For your healthy soil. And I should emphasize that it's healthy soil too. So unhealthy soil may not have this mix of constituents, but healthy soil generally does. Let's talk about those soil solids a little bit more. So even though there's less of them than we might have originally thought, soil solids are still important for us. So we can break them down into two fractions. There's the mineral fraction of the soil solids. That's about 45% of your soil's volume. And then there's the organic fraction, which is about 5%. The mineral fraction is very basically sand, silt, and clay. And there are some gravels and some larger rocks mixed in there as well, too. But sand, silt, and clay is really the backbone of the mineral fraction. What is sand? What is silt? What is clay? Well, basically, those three things are determined by their particle size. So a sand is any mineral particle, and don't think that you have to memorize these numbers, but sand is any mineral particle with a diameter, meaning a width, between 2 and 0.05 millimeters. Silt is a mineral particle with a diameter between 0.05 and 0.002 millimeters. And then clay is anything less than 0.002 millimeters in width or diameter. So these are all small by our standards, by the human scale, but sand is tremendously larger than silt, which is much larger than clay. A good analogy is if you've ever gone to a baseball game at Nationals Field in DC. The stadium is like a particle of sand, your car would be like a particle of silt, and the ticket to the game would be like a particle of clay. So this gives you a rough idea of the changes in size between these particles. Now, sand, silt, and clay is important because it leads to a very important physical characteristic of the soil called the soil's texture. So we turn sand, silt, and clay into a percentage. Basically, if we run the soil through a sieve and we extract all of the organic matter and we're just looking at sand, silt, and clay, the percentage of those three add up to the soil's texture, and those three percentages always add up to 100. So obviously a very sandy soil will have a high percentage of sand, a very silty soil will have a high percentage of silt, a clayey soil will have a high percentage of clay. But the three percentages will always add up to 100. And the soil's texture is important because it determines things like the ability of the soil to hold on to water and nutrients, the permeability of the soil, how quickly oxygen and water can travel from the surface down into the soil and reach the roots. All those are affected by the soil's texture. And the general pattern we see is the more clay you have, the better that soil holds on to materials, the better it retains water, the better it retains nutrients. Whereas the more sand you have, the easier it is for material to pass through the soil. So the faster air and water will percolate or infiltrate from the surface down into the soil and be available to the roots. The organic fraction, on the other hand, again, it's about 5% of the soil of volume, so it's not a very high percentage of the soil, but it's a very important one. It consists of living material and dead material. So the things that are alive in the soil that we can see, like your beetles, your earthworms, even the roots of the plants themselves, those are all part of the soil. We consider that to be part of the soil. But really, the bulk of the living organic fraction is microscopic. Bacteria, fungi, and very, very small things like protists, other very small things like protists, and what's shown here are little tiny microscopic arthropods, basically microscopic insects. For every teaspoon of healthy topsoil that you have, there's anywhere from about 100 million to 1 billion bacteria living there. Fungi are the other organism that we find tons and tons and tons of, literally tons of in the soil. They're multicellular. They exist as these little tiny twine-like root hairs. So these little tiny fungal roots work their way out through the soil, like little fingers working their way through the soil. If we could take all those fungal roots and lay them end to end to end, we'd find that for every teaspoon of healthy topsoil, again, you'd have anywhere from about 5 to 10 yards per teaspoon, up to, in some cases, 10 to 40 miles of fungal roots per teaspoon of soil. Generally, what we find is in forest soils, you generally have more fungi, and in agricultural or prairie soils, you generally tend to have more bacteria. But in either case, you're looking at millions and millions and billions and billions of organisms for every teaspoon. That's the living organic material. And another important part of the soil is the dead organic material. So these are the leaves, the twigs, the branches, the grass clippings, the animal manures, the dead animal carcasses that get added and dropped to the soil surface. This dead organic matter is actually the food source for the living organic matter. The reason that we have billions of bacteria and fungi living in the soil is that they have all this great food, all these falling leaves, twigs, branches, dead trees, dead animals, manures to eat and power themselves and allow them to grow and reproduce. So kind of as a recap, what is soil? Is it the intersection of the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, and the atmosphere? Is it a mix of sand, silt, and clay? Yes, it's all of those things. A mix of sand, silt, and clay with a little bit of organic matter added in. But it also, and perhaps more importantly, is a very important um, environment, a living habitat, a living environment for many, many, many organisms. And these living organisms are very important in two cycles, the nutrient cycle and the carbon cycle. So a lot of times we think of soil as what it consists of, but really for our purposes, soil is probably more important for what it does and the ecosystem that exists within that soil, because it's that ecosystem that really powers the fertility of the soil, meaning the ability of the soil to grow things, whether that's forests, whether that's a prairie, or whether that's the corn and soybeans and oats that the farmers grow in the field and is the base of our food system. So when we're looking at the soil ecosystem, when we're looking at any ecosystem, a very important constituent of that ecosystem, a very important characteristic is the food web, which basically determines how organic material and energy cycles through the ecosystem. And the base of the soil food web is dead organic matter. And this is provided primarily by plants. So as shown in the previous slide, obviously when fall comes around, the leaves start dropping off the trees. Whenever we have a windstorm, some trees will fall over, other trees will drop branches or twigs. Animals are defecating all the time on the soil surface. All of this is organic material that gets added down to the soil, and most of it is coming from the plants themselves. Plants also add organic matter directly into the soil through their roots. They're constantly pumping out organics through the fine roots as a means actually to sort of supercharge the soil food web, because they get a lot of benefit out of having a healthy food web. So plants are adding material through leaf fall and other stuff that's falling on the surface of the soil, but they're also pumping organic matter directly into the soil from their roots. And this organic matter then becomes the base of the soil food web. And sort of the next level of the soil food web is the first group of organisms that eat that organic matter, and we call them the decomposers. And as the name implies, they're the ones who take that organic matter and decompose it, basically digest it. Decomposers, there's more than just these two groups, but the most important groups of decomposers are the fungi and the bacteria. There's just so many of them, and they're the ones that really power the decomposition of organic material. They're very important because as they decompose the organic material, they eventually create what we call soil humus, Humus, not to be confused with hummus, Hummus, both nice and important. Soil humus doesn't taste that great, but it's great for soil fertility, because basically what the fungi and bacteria are doing is they are digesting all the fairly easy to decompose materials, the sugars, the waxes, the fats, things like that in that organic material. But they have a tough time decomposing that really tough stuff like cellulose, which is kind of the stuff that makes wood hard, lignins, cell walls, chitin, things like that. They're really fibrous stuff. They have a hard time decomposing that. That's the stuff that eventually gets turned into soil humus. Humus is basically the material that the fungi and the bacteria can't really digest. It's sort of the leftover waste product that's just too hard to decompose. Now, humus is really important because it's made out of this really resistant material. It actually stays in the soil for a long, long time. So humus can stick around in the soil, slowly decomposing for 50, 100, sometimes up to 200 years. So humus becomes a great means to store organic carbon in the soil for a long, long time on the manner of centuries. Those are our decomposers. Another important group in the soil food web are the shredders. Shredders, again, as the name implies, are critters that shred up organic material into smaller parts. And that doesn't seem like a very important role, but it really is, because when organic matter is shredded, the surface area of the organic matter increases greatly. And the smaller the shredders can break down this organic matter, the more surface area there is, and the easier it is for fungi and bacteria then to attach to that voluminous surface area and break down that organic material. So they sort of prep the organic material in a way that the fungi and bacteria can then break it down very easily. And then the last group, I'm actually kind of combining a whole bunch of different organisms and different functional groups into one. I group them under the banner of the nutrient liberators. So I'm kind of giving them short shrift. I really should give a little more attention to each of these layers, but we don't necessarily need to know all this stuff in detail. The important thing about the soil food web, really for us, other than the creation of humus and that long-term storage of organic carbon, is that as organic matter is processed through the soil food web, nutrients are released out into the soil in a soluble form, meaning a form that can be dissolved in water. That is really important because plant roots only take up two things from the soil. They take up oxygen and they take up water. Now you think, well, don't the plants get their nutrients from the soil? They do. But because they only take up oxygen and water, those nutrients have to be in a dissolved form in that water in order for the nutrients to get into the plant. So this, big grouping of organisms, basically what they do is there are various types of predators, many of which eat the fungi and the bacteria. Fungi and bacteria contain a lot of concentrated nutrients. They really like to jam their bodies full of nitrogen and phosphorus and all sorts of other good stuff. These higher level predators, they don't need quite that concentration of nutrients. So when they eat bacteria or fungi, what do? Well, they have more nutrients than they need in their own body, so they excrete it. They poop it out. And in that poop, that nutrient is now in a soluble form. It can dissolve in the soil water, and then the roots can take it up. So they basically take the nutrients that the fungi and the bacteria were hoarding for themselves, munch on those fungi and bacteria, and then poop out the extras in dissolvable form. So, again, I probably should give them a little more respect than that, but for our purposes, that's kind of what they do. And this allows nutrients to go back into the plants and eventually become the base of our above ground food web. So another recap. What is soil? It's the skin of the earth. It's a material that's about 50% solid, 25% air, 25% water by volume. Those solids are composed of mineral, meaning sand, silt, and clay, and organic fractions. And organic fraction is living organic material and dead organic material. And it's also a complex ecosystem and a complex food web that stores carbon and liberates nutrients for use by plants. How does soil come about? How does it form? Well, we have to look back at the parent material of soil, and there's really two general parent materials. That's rock and organic material. So it forms by a very slow weathering of these parent materials, these rocks and organics, through various natural processes, and we'll get into those processes and factors. Now you can imagine it's going to take quite a while to break down bedrock into those little particles of 2 millimeter or smaller sands, silts, and clays. Organics break down on a much faster basis. If you have a compost pile in your yard or at your school, you can throw a banana peel on it tonight and come back tomorrow and it's going to be pretty brown. But again, there's a big range. If you think about something like humus, that takes 200, maybe 250 years to break down. But if we combine these two together, breaking down bedrock and breaking down the organics, we'll see that on average, it takes about 100 to 500 years to create every new inch of soil. So it's a very slow process to build soil. And it's important too, because when we lose soil through erosion, through various other means, it's going to take a long time to get that soil back. So here's sort of a typical soil profile from Loudoun County. We're looking at about 42 inches of soil in this photo. So if you imagine 42 inches times 500 years, did it take 21,000 years to create the soil? Possibly. If we're going a little faster and we're creating an inch of soil every 100 years, obviously it would be a much smaller number. But still, we're talking thousands of years in order to create the deep soils that we see outside in our yards, in our farm fields, around our schools here in the Northern Virginia area. So what are the natural forces or factors behind soil formation? What's causing that bedrock to break down into sand, silt, and clay? What's causing that organic matter to decompose into soil humus? Well, there are 5 recognized soil forming factors. So these are sort of the natural forces that drive soil formation and power erosion, weathering, and breakdown. And they go by this acronym CLORPT, which isn't a great acronym. It's kind of hard to pronounce, but I hope that by being sort of an ugly word, it kind of makes it memorable. And if it's memorable, it becomes a good mnemonic device to remember the 5 soil forming factors. So maybe it's a good acronym after all. In CLORP, the CL stands for climate. O stands for organisms, not organics, organisms. A lot of people get that one wrong. The R stands for relief, which is just another term for landscape position or your topography. Where is the soil forming in the landscape? P is the parent material, the material from which the soil is weathering, from which it forms. And then T is time, which is sort of your master variable. It takes a lot of time for CLORPT to turn that big chunk of granite bedrock into little particles of sand, silt, and clay and humus. Let's go a little more into depth about these factors. Climate really affects the rate and extent of weathering. The basic rule that we see throughout the world is that hotter and wetter climates, meaning high temperatures and high rainfall, have fast weathering. If you put a compost pile out in the Amazon basin, in the rainforest, you can probably have finished compost within about a month and a half or so. If you try and make compost in northern Alaska, it's going to take a lot longer just because it's a much colder and drier climate. And that same thing happens with rocks as well, too. Rocks will actually break down faster into sand, silt, and clay when they're in a hot and wet environment versus a cold and dry environment. So what we find generally is that soils are deeper, more weathered, and often a little bit more acidic in hotter tropical environments than they are in colder places. Organisms are the power that adds and breaks down organic matter. So a tree is an organism, but so are the little tiny microscopic bacteria that live around the roots of the tree in the soil. All of these fall under that banner of soil organisms. So, all the plants that are growing out of the soil, they're the ones that are really adding organic matter to the soil through leaf fall, through, woody debris, and through the organics that they pump through their roots into the soil directly. And all the critters that living in the soil, they're the ones that are responsible for the breakdown of that organic matter that's being added. And this powers the cycle of both nutrients and carbon. So we talked about the nutrient cycle a little with the soil food web, a couple slides ago. But it's important to remember whenever nutrients are cycling around, they're cycling around attached to a much bigger pool of soil carbon. So your average soil bacteria, just as an example, generally seeks out a food source that has about 24 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So if you think about an element, a molecule of nitrate cycling around the soil food web, there's actually, it's attached to a ball of carbon that's 24 times larger than that. So wherever nutrients are cycling around, much more carbon is cycling around with it. Relief, so the position on the landscape that the soil is forming, that's really important for the erosion and drainage of the soil. So you can imagine if a soil is forming on the side of a really steep mountain, that's an area that just naturally will have high erosion. So that soil probably will never get very thick because as the bedrock underneath it is weathering in place and breaking down into sand, silt, and clay, it's building up a little bit of soil. But every time you have a rainfall, the rain is causing a lot of surface runoff that's flowing quickly down that steep slope. It strips off a little of that new soil that's being formed every time. So the soil just never has a chance to really get very thick. But let's say we go down to the bottom of that mountainside, down into the floodplain at the base or the valley. Those soils will probably be really thick because they're both weathering in place. There's bedrock under them, it's weathering, but they're also receiving all this eroded material that's flowing down the slopes of the mountain and depositing in that flat land down at the base. Drainage is really affected by relief as well, too. And this one is pretty self-explanatory. You can imagine a soil that's up at the top of that mountain. It's going to be pretty dry. soil that's on the steep side slopes of the mountain. That's going to be pretty dry. But you get down to the bottom of the mountain, what direction does water flow? It always flows in one direction, and that's downhill. So it's all flowing down to those valleys down at the bottom. The soils that form in those valleys will probably be pretty wet, and their groundwater will be pretty close to the surface. So if you were digging a well, you might only have to dig down 3, 4, 5 feet before you hit groundwater in those lower areas. Parent material, the material from which the weather forms, from which it weathers in place and forms our soils. We get traits from our parents. You think about your hair color, your eye color, your height. The soil gets a lot of traits from its parent material. So the chemistry of the soil often is very closely tied to the parent material. A soil that is very rich in iron probably weathered from a rock that had a lot of iron oxides inside of it. The color of the soil, we can often see, real big changes in color as we change from one rock type to another as we go over a different geology. And the texture of the soil as well, too. Just to give a local example, for those of you who live in Western Fairfax or Eastern Loudoun County, most of your rock out there is sedimentary shale and sandstones. The soil that forms from those rocks are a little bit clay, but not too much. They're not too sticky. But there's also some little pockets of diabase, which is a type of igneous rock. And actually, there's a lot of commercial mines on top of these diabase rocks, because that rock is very valuable for building purposes, for gravel, for underneath houses and underneath roadways. But the soil that forms from the diabase rock is extremely high in clay. It's very, very sticky. It feels like pottery clay, like stuff you could make mugs and bowls out of. And the only reason it's so different is that there's a change in the type of bedrock that it formed from. And you can find these soils right next to each other, right at the border of where the two rocks meet. So they can be 50 feet apart, but be totally different because their parent material is different. And then lastly, there's time. So time is sort of a master variable. You got to give a lot of time to climate, organisms, relief, and parent material to work to cause the weathering and erosion that creates the soil that we see. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes thousands and thousands of years. Generally, what we see with time is that older soils are deeper soils because it's had more time to sit and weather in place and break down that bedrock underneath and build up these various soil layers. Whereas a young soil often is a very thin soil. Maybe it might just be a couple inches over solid bedrock. And that's not to say that it won't get thicker. It just hasn't had the time in order for that bedrock to really break down into thick layers of sand, silt, and clay. So CLORPT really is what powers the variability in soil. No matter where you go in the world, those climate, organism, relief, parent material, time, all interacting with each other will be slightly different from spot to spot. And every time there's a little change in any one of those factors, you're going to see a little bit of a change in the soil type as well, too. So in the United States, we have about 20,000 recognized soil types. They get recognized by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So that gives you an idea of the type of variability that we're seeing, and that's all powered by these 5 soil-forming factors. So the various workings of CLORPT throughout the world will cause soils that have variations in colors, variations in depths, variability in the makeup, their chemical makeup, and sort of their what kind of molecules are in them. Are they rich in calcium? Are they rich in iron? Are they rich in magnesium or something else? The nutrient content as well too will vary from spot to spot. Some soils are very fertile, full of nutrients. Some soils just are not. They're pretty barren. It's hard to grow anything on them. The age of the soil, the depth of water table, groundwater, the acidity or basicity of the soil, all of that really goes back to CLORPT and the various interactions and workings of those 5 factors. So this is just a kind of a reminder that soil is not just plain brown dirt. It changes quite a bit from spot to spot. And as you'll see a little bit later, it changes as we dig from the surface down to a little bit of further depth in one spot. And if we're looking at the change, the effect that chlorpt has, it works over different scales. So, the climate, for instance, that's a big thing. Climate doesn't change too much anywhere in Northern Virginia. We all have fairly similar climates, but there are some microclimates, some fine, subtle changes. But the climate here is very different than the climate in, say, California or Florida or Alaska or Hawaii. So on that scale, there definitely will be changes in the soil type caused by climate. But in the local scale, meaning, the couple counties that make up Northern Virginia, climate is not going to be all that important of the soil forming factors because we just haven't covered enough area for the climate to really change that much. What is more important is the relief and the parent material. Those are really going to make big changes. And if we look from, let's say, Western Loudoun County, and we keep working our way east all the way till we get to Arlington, Alexandria, and the shores of the Potomac right over here, we've got several different types of parent material. Got the Leesburg line on west. You're in a geologic area called the Blue Ridge. This area has a lot of igneous, but also some metamorphic and sedimentary rocks. As we move east, we get into another area of differing geology called the Triassic Basin. The Triassic Basin is actually an old filled-in lake bed. This used to be a lake hundreds of millions of years ago. That lake filled in with fine sediment, and that fine sediment eventually fused into fine-grained sandstones, siltstones, and shales, all sedimentary rocks. So the soil here looks pretty different than the soil on the Blue Ridge because the rock types, the parent material, is different. As we move into Fairfax and parts of Prince William County, we get into an area called the Piedmont. The Piedmont is a mix of metamorphic, igneous rocks, some sedimentary as well too, but mostly metamorphic and igneous. These rocks generally tend to have a lot of mica in them, and mica is a mineral that is shiny. It reflects light. So as that mica breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces, it kind of looks like glitter working its way through the soil. So if you've ever dug in your yard and your hands come out and they look like they're covered with glitter, you probably live in the Piedmont. And then we get to the coastal plain. And the coastal plain is interesting because the soil in the coastal plain did not form from bedrock. Rather, the coastal plain used to be underwater. And as the old Potomac River, and in some cases even the Atlantic Ocean, washed over the coastal plain, it deposited lots and lots of parallel bands of sediment. So these are the sediments, the sand, silt, and clays that were washed in and dropped, deposited by old floodwaters. You will find bedrock in the coastal plain, but again, it might be 200-300 feet down. So the soil that's up at our feet that we're actually planting in, that our trees are living in, is soil that formed from those bands of sediment that were deposited by those old floodwaters. So there's a lot of difference in soils in these 4 different areas because of the differences in parent material. That's not to say that all the soil in the Piedmont is like all the other soil in the Piedmont. No, there's lots of different soil types in each one of these areas. And now those differences are really due to relief. So let's say you live in the Piedmont and you're up on the top of the hill. You're sitting nice and high. You're probably going to have a pretty dry soil. You go down to your neighbor 5 doors down. That neighbor's at the bottom of the hill. All the water is flowing down to their property. They might have a soil that has a similar amount of sand, silt, and clay, but their groundwater might be 2 feet from the surface. And every time they have a big rain, they might get a little bit of water into their basement. And that's not a change that's due to parent material. That's a change that's due to relief. So parent material kind of makes the larger scale changes over the local environment. Relief makes the very small scale changes over the local environment. So soil from Western Loudoun is different from the soil in Eastern Fairfax and Alexandria and Arlington because of parent material. But the soil of the high neighbor in Loudoun County versus the low neighbor at the end of the block in Loudoun County, that's probably due to relief. Here's just an example of how the local scale can change soil due to changes in relief. It might be a little hard to see this on the slide, but I'm kind of trying to pull out the thickness of the topsoil. It's that dark band of material at the top of the soil, right at the surface. You can see as we go down the hill, that topsoil gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And the reason for this is the wetter a soil is, generally the slower organic matter breaks down. So this soil down here in the wetlands is pretty much saturated all the time. Organic matter builds up in here, but it breaks down very slowly. Probably an equal amount of organic matter is being added to these soils up here, but they're drier, and they get drier and drier as you go towards the top. Drier soils tend to break down their organic matter faster, so you never get this huge accumulation of dark organic matter up at the surface like you would down in the wetland. Otherwise, these soils might be fairly similar, but because of this one change, which is relief, you can see a noticeable change in some of the soil layering. That's just one example, and hopefully a visual one that you can actually see. And I'm a visual learner. If you guys are too, hopefully that makes things a little clear about one way in which one of the 5 soil forming factors, in this case relief, can change the actual appearance of a soil. So we've got the 5 soil forming factors, but there's also these soil forming processes. So the factors are kind of like the raw force that creates soil. The processes are the way those forces actually act within the soil itself, the sort of the mechanisms by which they change the soil. So the factors are the raw factors, the power. The processes are the way those powers are channeled through the soil. And we've got 4 soil forming processes: inputs, translocations, transformations, and losses. Inputs are, just as the name implies, it's the addition of new material into the soil. So there's a variety of ways new material can be added in, but generally the ones that are most obvious to us are the additions of organic matter from the surface. As plants die, as they pump out organic matter through their roots, that's adding new organic carbon to the soil. Rainfall obviously adds a lot of material, the most obvious being the water itself from the rain. But as rain passes through the atmosphere, it dissolves other materials too. Sometimes they're fine particulate materials. Sometimes it dissolves gases in the atmosphere too. Oftentimes, especially when we have higher carbon dioxide concentrations in our soil or higher nitrogen oxide concentrations, which is something that gets pumped out by industry, that material, those gases, will dissolve in the rain as those raindrops pass through the atmosphere and cause the rain to become more acidic. So that means acids are getting added to the soil when that rain hits. And then, of course, there's oxygen as well, too. Oxygen from the soil diffuses down through the pores into the soil and works its way to the roots and the microbes. Translocations, it's just a fancy word for movement of material within the soil. One big translocation that we see commonly in soil is the movement of clay. Clay often starts forming up here right at the soil surface. But if we're digging in soil, we'll find that the clay is usually found in highest concentrations in the subsoil. Why is this? Well, every time it rains, that rainwater passes through the soil pores, the channels, and on its way down, it picks up a few of those clay particles, just erodes them, and erodes them down deeper and deposits them in this subsoil down here. So over time, this area below gets enriched with clay, and that clay content actually increases with time. And over time, this clay band gets deeper as well, too, as water passes deeper into the soil and erodes that clay further down. The transformation is the changing of materials within the soil. So one example of that is the weathering of parent material. Down here in the deep subsoil, you find a lot of these transformations. You find them up here as well, too. But one that you find down here in the deep subsoil is the weathering of parent material, in this case, bedrock, into sand. So no matter how far you go, eventually you're going to hit that solid rock. That solid rock generally first weathers into sand before it then weathers into silts and clays. And sand is basically just pulverized little bits of bedrock. It's bedrock that's been broken into little pieces, but it hasn't chemically changed at all. It's still the same. It's sort of like a little tiny piece of bedrock. So just above the bedrock, you'll find a lot of this transformation of parent material into sand as roots work their way down, as natural acids build up in the soil and work their way down into the deep subsoil. Those will help to break up that solid rock and turn it into those little particles of sand. And then lastly, we've got losses. Losses are materials leaving the soil. If you're a farmer and you put a lot of ammonium nitrate into your soil, and then unfortunately afterwards there's a big rain that comes, a couple hours after you added your fertilizer. Well, nitrate is very soluble, meaning it's easy to dissolve. A lot of that nitrate is going to be lost. It's going to leach out of the bottom of the soil and flow down into our groundwater, which is not a good thing. But that's one example of leaching of soluble nutrients like nitrate. Other materials will naturally leach out of the soil as well. Silica, calcium, magnesium, things like that are constantly slowly dripping out of the bottom of the soil through the natural erosive processes and dissolving processes of rainwater. What does soil look like? It's a layered system. It has various layers that we call horizons. So the master set of horizons, this is all the horizons you can possibly find in a soil. It doesn't mean that you're going to find all of these horizons in every soil, but these are the total number of horizons. So potentially you could find all of these in one soil, but oftentimes what you'll find is a subset of these in your soil. We've got the O horizon, the A horizon, the E horizon, the B horizon, the C horizon, and then the R horizon. O, A, E, B, C, R. And I almost guarantee that you're going to be asked to name all these horizons somewhere on an Envirothon test. The 5 soil forming factors and the soil horizons are good things to memorize. Wink, wink, hint, hint. So, what are these horizons? Well, the O horizon stands for organics. The O stands for organics. And it really, most people actually don't even think of this as part of the soil, but technically it is. It is a layer of organic litter on the surface of the ground. It's specifically the partially decomposed organic matter. So you put a leaf onto the ground. It's not quite the O horizon yet. It has to start decomposing in place before it's considered the O horizon. So in this grassy field that we're showing here, if you brushed aside some of those grass blades and look down on the soil surface, you probably see just a little, maybe a fraction of an inch of decomposing bits of organics, grass blades, other things like that. That's going to be your O horizon. The O horizon is easiest to see in the forest because you've got that fairly thick layer of decomposing forest litter that covers the ground of the forest. And that's an easy to see O horizon. Where most people think of soil starting, it's here in the A horizon. This is what we commonly refer to as topsoil. The A horizon is your first subsurface layer, and it tends to be very rich in organics, specifically humus. Humus is a very dark brown, black material. So a soil layer like the A horizon that's rich in humus is also going to be dark brown and black. And that's usually how we tell where the A horizon starts and stops. Where that dark brown or black color starts to disappear, that means you're getting out of your A horizon and getting down into some of your deeper horizons. The A horizon in Virginia, it's probably only about 2 to 5 inches thick on average, so it's pretty small. But even though it's very narrow, very shallow, this is where most of the biological activity in soil is occurring. So this is where those billions of bacteria per teaspoon and yards and miles of fungal root hairs per teaspoon are occurring. That's not to say that there's nothing living below the A horizon, but the numbers and the concentration of living organic matter starts to drop significantly as you go deeper beyond the A horizon. The reason there's so much living material in here is because they're all after that organic material that's coming from the soil surface and from the roots of the plants, and it's most concentrated in the A horizon. Next, we have our E horizon, which I would say you probably see. You don't see this in the majority of Virginia soils. I would say less than half of Virginia soils have an E horizon. But if you do have it, what it's going to look like is kind of a leached pale color. I call it the acid wash genes layer of the soil. Because what happens in the E horizon, the E really stands for exit. It's the material where things are weathered out of. Basically, the soil in the E horizon has this pale color because all the things that can stain soil have been washed out or leached out of this layer. like things like iron oxides or things like organics, which stain the color a black, stain the soil a black color. Iron oxides stain the soil red, yellow, or orange. Well, they all been leached out of this layer, and what's left behind is kind of this palish, almost gray in some cases layer. So the reason it's here is that, again, it's right below the A horizon. The A horizon has a ton of organic material and a ton of organic activity, microbial activity occurring. It's creating, as that organic matter breaks down, a lot of natural organic acids. And a lot of these acids then get washed down into the E horizon after heavy rains. And this tends to, again, sort of acid wash or leach everything out of this layer and just leave behind that pale grayish color. Where does the stuff that leaches out of the E horizon go? Goes to the B horizon. This is where you find your clay. This is where you find your color. So the B horizon often has a, by soil standards, fairly bright red, yellow, or orange color. That's from all the iron oxides that leached out of the E horizon. And the clays tend to deposit in the B horizon as well, too. So it's usually kind of a dense, sticky feeling layer. I'd say in most cases, if you're digging in your backyard or around your school, you're probably going to go straight from the A horizon down to the B horizon and skip over the E. But every now and then, some soils you'll find there's a nice A, a very clear E, and then the B horizon down below. But if the soil is very orange, red, yellow, it's very sticky, it feels very dense, chances are you're in the B horizon, because that sounds like a really clay layer. And the B horizon is where you find that clay and also that iron oxide, which gives the soil the red, yellow, and orange color. Iron oxide is basically rust, natural soil rust. So think of those rusty red, yellow, orange colors. That's B horizon iron oxide. Next, we have the C horizon. This is sort of a border layer between the soil and the rock down below. Basically, it's like the first material that weathers from the solid bedrock. If you think of a sculptor chipping away at a big block of marble that eventually will be turned into a guy on a horse. I don't know. What happens when that sculptor is chipping away with his rock hammer or his chisel? Well, it creates this kind of mess on the floor of little gravels and rocks and sands and things like that that are falling off that block of bedrock. And that's kind of what the sea horizon looks like. It's sort of a coarser, sandier, drier layer than the B horizon up above, because it's just sort of loose raw material, physically pulverized bedrock that's just begun to weather off the bedrock itself. So it can often be hard to tell where the B horizon ends and the C horizon starts, but usually what we use here locally is the clay percentage starts to decrease as you get into the C horizon. So the soil begins to feel drier, looser, sometimes coarser, more sands and gravels, and less of those fine clays. Clays hold on to the water really well, so as you get that C horizon with less clay, it often feels like the moisture is dropping out. The soil is getting really dry. And then finally, there's the R horizon. R stands for rock. That's the unweathered bedrock. So basically, if you can't dig down anymore, you probably hit the bedrock. If you're just clanging your shovel off something really, really hard, chances are that's the R horizon. Talked about soil texture before, which is the percentage of sand, silt, and clay. Another really important physical characteristic of the soil is the soil structure, which also determines what the soil looks like. And this is a little more subtle, though. It's kind of easy to see the soil horizons when you're looking at a big pit in the ground. It can be a little tougher to see the soil structure because it's made out of much smaller things. So soil will naturally clump into these little blocks, these little aggregates that we call PEDs. So when you're looking at soil, what you're really looking at is thousands and thousands of these little PEDs all kind of smushed together. The important thing about PEDs is that they have pore spaces. So what separates one PED from its neighboring PED? There's a pore, there's an open channel. And these aren't necessarily really big, and they can sometimes be hard to see, but they're big enough to allow air and water to pass down through the soil. And within the pad, on the interior of the pad, there are also pores, but those are much smaller. So we call the interior pores micropores, And the pores outside of the ped, basically the pores that separate one ped from its neighboring peds, those are called macropores. So macropores are really important at allowing oxygen and water into the soil from the surface. Micropores are really good at soaking up some of that water and holding it for a long period of time so that the roots then have access to it. So those are sort of like capillary pores or wicking pores, those little micropores. Here's some actual soil peds. This is granular. We often find this kind of soil structure, soil peds in the A horizon. Here's another example of granular, just drawn as an illustration rather than a photo. Here's blocky structure, which we'll often find in the B horizon, which is basically the same shape as the granular structure. They're just bigger. So here's the blocky structure drawn out as an illustration. These are good types of structure to have because these types generally tend to be very loose, meaning they've got big pores that allow that air and water to get into the soil very quickly. Fortunately, what we find a lot of in urban areas is platy structure, which is what happens often. It can be naturally forming, but a lot of times it's formed because of the influence of people. If we take this nice, loose, granular structure or blocky structure with its big pores, low density, and then we run it over with construction machinery, we tend to pack it down, smush it down, and squeeze out a lot of those pores. What's left behind is this platy structure. Here's an illustration of it. So those plates kind of lock very tightly one on top of each other, and there's just not a lot of space for pores. So it means that this compacted platy structure generally lets in oxygen and water at a much slower rate, which can be a real problem from the soil and also for water quality, which we'll get into in just a little bit. So again, you want that good granular and blocky structure. You don't really want that platy structure because that's often a sign of human-caused soil compaction. Now, with soil structure allows for this dispersion of materials. So where did all that air and water come from? Where did all the space for it come from? It's the pore spaces. The pore spaces between and inside of PEDs are basically just open channels that can be filled with either air or water. So the reason that soil is only 50% solid is because soil has good structure. Now, if you were to take that soil and compact it and turn it into platy structure, what we might find is that soil is now 75% solid, and there's only 25% of the soil volume to fit that air and water, which obviously means that there's a reduction of oxygen and water getting down to the roots and to all the soil microbes. But good structure will create this mix of 50% solids, 25% air, 25% water. When you're looking at soil, the soil color can tell you quite a bit. Certain soil colors will indicate that there are a lot of certain things in the soil. So just to give you some examples, organic matter content. Generally, the darker the soil, the more organic matter is in the soil, especially soil humus. This is actually from a peat bog in Scotland. So you're never going to see a soil quite like this. We just don't have that type of soil around here. But this is a soil that is mostly organic material, mostly soil humus. The darker it is, generally the more organics are in it. But colors can also indicate the drainage class of soil. Basically, how deep do you have to dig in order to hit groundwater? If you find a soil that is entirely red, yellow, or brown, like this one over here, that's a dry soil. Very red soil, that's the iron oxides. Yellows and browns are different types of iron oxides. If it's entirely of those colors, generally speaking, that's a nice dry soil. No high groundwater, or at least you haven't hit the groundwater yet. If, on the other hand, you find a soil that has lots of splotches of grays, whites, and blacks, but specifically grays, mixed in with your typical red, yellow, and brown colors like in the previous picture, that's a soil that's wet. So when iron oxide is present in the soil, it creates those red, yellows, and oranges. And iron oxide forms from the combination of iron and oxygen. When soil is really wet, there's not a lot of oxygen in it. The pores are all filled with water. And the iron oxide dissolves. It turns into a different chemical form that can dissolve and wash away. And what's left behind when that iron oxide stain is no longer there is this kind of bluish gray color that you're seeing in the center of this slide. And you can see it's not all bluish gray. We still have some bands of yellowish red iron oxide in some spots. So that's why we call it kind of a splotchy color, or some people call it a mottled color. But if you're seeing a lot of these kind of bluish or grayish colors, or even just a few, it means that those sections of soil are saturated for part of the year, meaning the pores are entirely filled with water. And basically it means that you've hit the groundwater layer. Even if it's dry now, sometime in the year, that groundwater is going to rise to the height of those splotchy gray colors. So remember, these are general rules. When you're looking at your soil, remember to look around and figure out what landscape you're in. If you're digging in a soil and you're seeing all these gray colors and you look up and right next to that soil pit, there's a stream, well, you can be pretty sure that this is indeed indicating a very wet soil. If on the other hand, you're finding a few gray colors and you're trying to figure out if that's telling you the soil has high water table, and you look around here and you're at the very top of a hill and everything is sloping down around you, well, maybe it's just a naturally gray soil. Maybe that isn't a sign of high groundwater, because you wouldn't really expect to find high groundwater at the top of the hill. You would expect to find it down at the bottom of the hill where the streams and rivers are. So kind of use some common sense when you're trying to figure out what the soil is trying to tell you, what the soil colors are trying to tell you.
Hey, Dan, I just wanted to let you know that we have about 10 minutes left before we've got some time for questions.
Okay, sounds good. One specific thing I have to mention, there's something called hydric soil, which is a very specific type of soil that you find in wetlands. You'll find questions about hydric soils on some of the Envirothon tests. Sometimes I throw it in mine, but a lot of times you'll find it as you advance to higher levels in Envirothon. Hydric soils are a requirement. If you are in a wetland, you have to have hydric soils. It's actually a legal requirement. So what do hydric soils mean? Well, basically, they're types of soils that are very poorly drained. They have groundwater very near the surface. And once you get down past your organic rich A horizon, you're going to find, for the most part, that hydric soils are predominantly gray below that layer of topsoil right at the surface. So they're going to look just like this photo here. So going back to this illustration of the 5 soil forming factors, chlorpt, and looking at some of the changes, this time in drainage due to changes in relief or landscape position. What you'll see here, again with soil color, is that the subsoil of this high soil is very kind of brownish, a little bit red, reddish brown, but you can see how much grayer it gets as we start moving down the hillside until we get to the wetland soil and it's mostly gray. So this is, again, a visual change that you can see as you dig through these soils, as you work your way down the hillside. You will see this noticeable visual change. And it doesn't translate too well here, but obviously if you're digging the soils in real life, you're looking at it at a much larger scale. And hopefully these color changes would really pop out at you then. So let's get into the home stretch. Why soil is important. The first thing is it gives us physical support. We need something to hold up our buildings. We need something to hold up our trees, and it does that admirably, even though soil is only 50% solid material. But we're going to get a little bit more into the water cycle, nutrient cycle, and the carbon cycle. So the water cycle, you can think of soil as being a global sponge and filter that covers the entire world. It's like the world's Brita filter. When water falls on the surface of the soil, it can do one of two things. It can either soak in, it can become surface runoff, or it can evaporate and transpirate back into the atmosphere. And what we ideally want is to maximize the amount of water that soaks in and minimize the amount that becomes surface runoff. And that's because whenever water hits the surface, it can dissolve or wash away stuff that's on the surface, and not all of this stuff is good. So as water is percolating down into the soil, it could contain things like nitrates from fertilizers, phosphates also from fertilizers. You could have bad bacteria like E. coli. You could have motor oil from the roadways. You could have pesticides from a farm field or even from your lawn. Or you could have other pathogens, from animal manures or things like that. If this water is allowed to run over the surface, all of this stuff that's now dissolved in that water is flowing with that surface runoff, and that will go into the nearest stream or river, which of course we don't want it to do. But if that water is percolating down into the soil, in the soil we have clay, we have humus, and we have those billions and billions of microbes. And clay and humus are really good at binding potential pollutants to their surface, and microbes are really good at breaking those potential pollutants down into something non-harmful. So it's really the microbes. Clays and humus are sort of like physical filters. They hold those bad things in the soil, but it's the microbes that really break those bad things down. So the pathogens, the bad bacteria, those microbes don't like to have those in their home turf. So they'll kill them off. They outcompete them and basically kill them. Pesticides and oil, they're not natural. Microbes don't like them, but as long as they're there in a low enough concentration that they don't kill the microbes often will be able to break these down because, as odd as it sounds, oil and pesticides are organic materials, which means they contain carbon. And microbes are very good at breaking down carbon-containing materials into constituent parts that are not harmful. And phosphates and nitrates, the microbes would love that because that's fertilizer to them. That's going to help them grow. It's giving them the nutrients that they need and keeping those nutrients out of the water. So as odd as it sounds, if you run water through dirt, it actually comes out cleaner on the bottom. So as the water passes through the soil, it gets filtered and cleaned. And then by the time some of that water flows down into the groundwater, which eventually flows, the groundwater provides the base flow for a lot of our streams and rivers. That groundwater stays pretty clean because of the filtering action of the soil above it. The problem with the water cycle and the role of soil is that we're making a lot of disturbances to it through impervious surfaces and compaction of soil. So every time you have a development, you're running over the soil, and you do have to compact it in order to make the soil strong enough to hold up houses and streets without them settling and cracking and breaking their structures. But this unfortunately causes the soil to pack down and reduces a lot of the pore spaces and prevents water from flowing into that soil at nearly the rate it did when that soil was natural. Impervious surfaces are even worse. Impervious surface is any surface that doesn't let water pass through. So this would be things like asphalt, concrete, the rooftops of buildings themselves. If you have an impervious surface, you're basically preventing any water from getting down into the soil. And the more of compacted soil and impervious surfaces we have, the more water that falls on the surface of the land becomes surface runoff instead of soaking down into the soil where it can be held and filtered. And because of all this surface runoff, what we're finding a lot of is erosion. And it might be erosion in a place you wouldn't necessarily suspect. It's erosion within our streams and our rivers. Because what we're essentially doing in urban areas is that we're converting a lot of the water that normally would have soaked down into the soil and be held there because soil is this big sponge. And instead, we're turning it into surface runoff. And not only that, we have all these drains on the side of our roads, which leads down to pipes, which then outlet into the nearest stream. So we've created a fast path for that excess surface runoff to drain away and drain down into our streams and rivers. So every time it rains, and rains hard, it's almost like there's a little flash flood of surface runoff that flows through our streamways, and it causes the streams to erode out wider and deeper. And this is a problem for the stream because this makes a pretty tough habitat, but it's also a problem for the receiving bodies of water, the Potomac River and the Chesapeake, because every time we have a heavy rain, it's stripping off a little bit of this bare soil that you see on the side of our stream channels. And that doesn't seem like that would be too important, but you think if you just strip off a millimeter of this bank, we've got thousands of miles of stream bank just in Fairfax County alone, but also Loudoun County, Prince William, and anywhere else. All those combined, it adds up to thousands of tons of loose sediment that gets washed into our major rivers every time we have a storm. And obviously, you don't want your dirt in your water. So that's a big problem that we have to deal with. Going back to the nutrient and carbon cycles. So that was the water cycle. Now the nutrient and carbon cycles, and I apologize for going fast, but I want to try and fit all this stuff in. Again, it all starts down there with organic matter that's added to the soil primarily by the plants. That material powers our fungi and bacteria that decompose that organic matter. And eventually, as the fungi and bacteria are eating that organic material and the nutrients within it, the nutrients get turned into a soluble form that can dissolve in the water within the soil and then be taken back up by the plant roots. So in effect, the decomposers, your bacteria and your fungi, are really sort of the determining or most important cog or a locus within the nutrient cycle. They're breaking down the organic material, and eventually this causes the nutrients within that organic material to be liberated and dissolved in the soil water. The nutrients go out into the soil. The producers, the plants, have their roots working all the way through the soil. They're picking up these nutrients, sucking them up with the water, and using those nutrients to power new shoots, new leaves, new fruits, new growth. And that new growth then becomes both the basis of the soil food web, but also of our terrestrial food web. So these vegetables, plants, whatever, they're eaten by our lower level herbivorous consumers. Those herbivorous animals are eaten by our higher level predators, whether it's coyote, red fox, or us. And then eventually everything does die. And when it dies, its carcass is returned to the soil where it's processed by the decomposers. The nutrients that were stored within that animal body are then released back into the soil and the cycle continues. This is happening all over the world. And remember, whenever nutrients are cycling around, there's a much bigger pool of carbon that's cycling with it. And what we find is if we look at soil globally, soil is a carbon sink, meaning it takes in more organic matter than it puts out. And this is because it takes a lot of that organic matter and turns it into that resistant humus, which can stay in the soil for hundreds and hundreds of years. And where we find the most carbon storage is up in our northern areas. If you think about chlorped, what do we have up here? We have really, really cold soils. Those cold soils tend to break down organic matter at a much slower rate. The problem is with modern farming practices and modern development as well too, we often increase the rate at which the carbon in soil breaks down. And when it breaks down, about half of that carbon becomes carbon dioxide. So with bad modern farming practices, we tend to exacerbate global warming because we're breaking down that stored humus and carbon in the soil and turning it into carbon dioxide. But there are other practices which can cause more carbon to get added to the soil and be stored. So it's a matter of changing some of our practices in order to do this good carbon farming. Two of the things that really break down carbon in soil quickly is tillage, meaning the old-fashioned plow, overgrazing. Basically, wherever you have bare soil, you can see this nice dark soil exposed to the surface. When you expose that dark topsoil to the surface, there's a lot more oxygen in the surface air than there is in the air within the soil, even in shallow depths. And this causes that organic matter to break down faster when it's exposed to that higher concentrated amount of oxygen. I'm not going to get into these too much because I'm throwing too much information at you already, but I did want to talk about some of the soil farming practices, some of the changes in farming practices that can create healthier soil and more organic carbon-rich soil. And a lot of these are to rely less on fertilization and plowing. And instead, what farmers will try to do is feed the soil microbes instead. Oops. So how do they do this? They add organic material. But really, what I think there's a new paradigm on soil health that's being pushed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and they focus on these four practices: maximize biodiversity, maximize continuous living roots, maximize soil cover, and minimize disturbance. I like these because they tend to simplify what can be a very complex suite of practices into sort of broader, more easy to understand goals. So let's look at them one by one. What do you mean by maximize biodiversity? Basically, to maximize biodiversity in soil, you want to maximize the diversity of plants you're growing on the soil. If you're just growing acres and acres of corn, corn has a very specific set of roots that go down into the soil, and they tend to simplify the soil microbial population. If you have a very complex mix of different things growing on the surface, that tends to mean that different types of organic matter are being added to the soil, and this creates more diversity of the microbes that are living in soil. And this is very good for the soil health. More diversity generally in any ecosystem means more stability and more production. You want to maximize the continuous living roots. Basically, you never want to have your soil fallow, meaning having the soil just sit bare like this. That's about the worst thing you could ever do for it. Instead, what you see farmers doing, and this works for gardens as well too, it doesn't have to be just a big farm field, is they're growing things like cover crops. And cover crops are things that are grown over the winter strictly to keep a vegetative, growing, living cover on the soil. These are not things that are harvested. Rather, what happens is when it comes to spring and the farmer is ready to start planting the actual crops that make him money that he's going to harvest, he'll come in and he'll mow down or sometimes spray down with pesticides those cover crops and just let them rot on the soil surface. What this does is they rot and decompose, they add lots of organic matter to the soil. And that's a really great thing. Last two I've kind of combined together because they really go hand in hand. You want to maximize soil cover and minimize disturbance. And really all of these practices that I mentioned previously do that. Basically, you want to have something growing on the soil at all times, or if not something growing, at least leave some sort of cover on the soil. And that could be the remnants of last year's crop, like this farmer is doing right here. He's plowing the new crop right into the stubble from last year's crop. But it could be something as simple as spreading out a little hay as a means of mulch over your garden rows. So it doesn't have to be anything, really complicated. As long as the soil is covered, it's going to be protected from erosion. It's insulated a little bit. And this organic material that you're using for coverage is going to slowly break down and add organic matter to the soil as well, too. So in all respects, what you're trying to do is protect the soil and add more organic material that will feed that soil food web. And that's really what the USDA is trying to push in terms of long-term soil health and viability of agriculture. Very quickly, I'm just going to mention, if you're interested in what soil you have, the best source of information is the county soil survey, which is basically a map of all the soil types within a county, and you can find it on a website called the Web Soil Survey. That's not the URL, but just go to Google, type in Web Soil Survey. There's only one, and it'll pull up soil maps for just about any part of the United States. And those maps will describe things like the soil's physical and chemical properties and the soil's suitability for various uses like farming or engineering. And it's very useful, and you will definitely be asked in the Envirothon competition to look through a soil survey map and make some decisions about which soil would be best for farming corn, which soil would be best if you were interested in, as a developer, in putting in a couple houses with basements, things like that. The Web Soil Survey will give you those answers. So I apologize for rushing. I realized I was going a little slow and I wanted to get all the slides in. But if you, as your team is preparing, if you have any questions about soil, feel free to write down my contact information and shoot those questions over to me, and I will happily try my best to answer them.